You stand on the bow of a narrow, dark, wooden ship, the icy wind cutting your face and the smell of salt mingling with the odor of dried fish and smoke. It is the year 820, somewhere between the coast of Norway and the open waters of the North Atlantic. There is no land in sight, only gray waves, a seemingly endless sky, and the constant sound of wood creaking beneath your feet. You are one of the men aboard a Viking longship, and you know this journey could last weeks, perhaps months. There is no supermarket on the horizon, no refrigerator, no potable water flowing from a tap. There is only what you brought, what you know how to do, and what the sea happens to offer. Imagine the problem ahead. About 30 men crammed into a space smaller than a volleyball court. Every inch of the ship is occupied by oars, ropes, weapons, and provisions tied together with rawhide. There is no kitchen, no fire lit most of the time. A single wrong spark could mean the total destruction of the vessel in minutes. And yet, these men need to eat, need to maintain enough strength to row for hours, fight if necessary. They also need to survive the cold that robs the body of calories faster than any physical activity. How exactly did a society that lived more than 100 years ago manage to solve a problem? That problem still challenges modern polar expeditions with all the technology available. That is the question that will guide everything you are about to discover. How did the Vikings spend entire months at sea without starving, without their food spoiling, and without losing the strength to row, fight, and survive? The answer? Get ready. It's not what most people imagine. There was no magic, no blind luck, and certainly no infinite stock of food hidden in some secret cellar. There was science applied in practice centuries before any food preservation laboratory existed. There was empirical observation transformed into technique, repeated generation after generation, until it became an almost perfect system of maritime food logistics. The popular image of the Viking is that of a savage warrior, driven by fury and instinct, looting villages without any planning. But this image hides a much more interesting truth. Behind each successful expedition was a careful calculation of how many kilograms of food each man would consume per day, how much this would occupy on the ship, and how long each type of food would last before spoiling. A Viking who poorly planned his food didn't return home. And those who did were precisely those who mastered preservation techniques so efficient that they are still studied today by food historians and experimental archaeologists. To understand this ingenuity, it is necessary to first visualize the invisible enemy that every seafarer faced: time. Fresh meat under normal conditions begins to spoil in a matter of hours. Fish spoils even faster, and ordinary bread molds in a few days of constant humidity, especially inside an open ship exposed to sea spray, rain, and abrupt temperature variations. Any ordinary food would become poison in less than a week. The Vikings knew this, not because they had read some manual, but because, generation after generation, they observed what worked and what killed. Each expedition that failed due to famine became a lesson for the next. And it is precisely here that the story begins to reveal itself as a fascinating puzzle. Because the Viking solution was not a single ingenious trick, but a set of intertwined techniques, each one solving a specific part of the problem: drying, salting, fermentation, smoking, and, perhaps the most surprising element of all, a strategic choice, of which animals and plants were even worth taking on board. In the following parts of this narrative, you will discover, piece by piece, how each of these techniques worked in practice, why they still make sense from a modern, scientific point of view, and how this knowledge helped shape one of the most influential cultures in European history. Prepare yourself, because what seemed like simple survival was, in fact, food engineering refined through centuries of trial and error. You watch one of the older men in the crew pull a piece of fish as hard as wood from inside a leather bag. He beats the fish against the side of the ship, breaking it into smaller pieces, and begins to chew calmly, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. This is dried cod known today as stockfish, and it is without exaggeration one of the greatest silent inventions in the history of human food. The process is simple to describe, but it requires patience and precise knowledge of the climate. The fish is cleaned without any salt and hung on wooden racks outdoors, exposed to the cold, dry wind of northern Scandinavia for weeks. The low temperature prevents the proliferation of bacteria, while the constant wind removes all moisture from the flesh. The result is a food that can last for years, not months, years, keeping a good portion of its proteins intact. Think of it as an inverted mirror of what we do today. While a modern refrigerator uses electricity to cool and slow down decomposition, the Vikings used the very extreme climate of Scandinavia as a gigantic natural refrigerator. There was no motor, no compressor, no electricity. There was only the intelligence to understand that wind and cold combined eliminated the need for any complex technology. This dried cod became so light and compact that a single man could carry the equivalent of several days' worth of protein in a space smaller than a shoebox. But dried fish only solved part of the problem. What about pork and mutton, for example, could not be dried in the same manner because their specific fat composition tends to spoil at a much faster rate. For these meats, the solution was different: intense salting. The Vikings had access to large quantities of salt produced by evaporating seawater in shallow tanks or boiled in iron cauldrons. By completely covering the meat in coarse salt, they removed the water present in the muscle tissues through a process that any biology student today would recognize as osmosis. Without water, the bacteria that cause decomposition simply could not multiply. Salted meat could be stored in wooden barrels for months, only needing to be washed in water before consumption to remove excess salt. Now imagine the contrast between two scenarios. On one side, a common medieval army trying to cross land with fresh meat that needed to be consumed within a few days, risking disease and constant food poisoning. On the other side, a Viking crew organized and carrying barrels of salted meat and sacks of dried fish, capable of remaining away from any port for weeks without any significant risk of food shortages. This difference was not luck. It was logistical planning applied with almost military precision decades before any European army adopted similar systems in an organized way. Besides meat and fish, there was another fundamental element: grains. Barley and rye were carried on board in the form of coarse flour or hard breads, specially baked to withstand the sea's humidity. These breads were so stiff that they needed to be softened in water, beer, or even milk before being consumed, especially by older or wounded men. And here comes another fascinating detail. Beer and mead were not just celebratory drinks in practice, they were a safe source of liquid. This is because fresh water, when stored for weeks in wooden barrels, quickly became contaminated with bacteria, acquiring a rotten taste and becoming dangerous. Beer, on the other hand, through its fermentation process, killed a large portion of these microorganisms, paradoxically making it safer to drink than stagnant itself. This is the moment when the initial perception begins to change completely. You may have imagined the Vikings as brute warriors focused only on fighting and looting, without any sophistication beyond physical strength. But what is revealed here is a society extremely attentive to biological and chemical processes. Even without the scientific vocabulary we have today, they understood the principles of dehydration, osmosis, and fermentation in practice, because the life and death of an entire expedition depended directly on this knowledge. It wasn't laboratory theory. It was knowledge accumulated through generations of errors deaths, and silent adjustments passed down from father to son, from commander to crew, until it became an almost infallible system of maritime survival. Now, imagine the moment when, after 40 days of travel, the ship finally sights land. The men are thin in their skin, cracked by wind and salt, but still standing, still rowing, still alive. Not because they were lucky, but because every decision made before departure, weeks or even months before, was calculated with extreme care. Historians who study these expeditions estimate that each man consumed on average between 2,000 and 3,000 calories daily, a high number but necessary since rowing in icy waters for hours on end requires energy, expenditure comparable to that of high-performance athletes today. Without this amount of energy, the body simply wouldn't withstand the constant cold, which relentlessly steals heat from the body, even during intense physical exertion. Exertion. This is where another powerful contrast comes in. Consider a much later European expedition, centuries later, during the so-called Age of Exploration, China. Sailors from countries like Portugal and Spain, despite having access to more accurate maps, compasses, and larger vessels, suffered terribly from scurvy, a disease caused by a lack of vitamin C, which rotted gums and slowly killed centuries earlier. The Vikings, without any knowledge of vitamins already, had dietary habits that reduced this risk. These habits included the occasional consumption of fermented vegetables and dried fruits, as well as raw fish consumed quickly after capture. These foods were still rich in nutrients that are lost with prolonged cooking. It wasn't scientific knowledge in the modern sense, but it was a direct result of observation. Those who ate certain foods got sick less often, and this pattern repeated for generations, becoming a solid dietary tradition. But it would be naive and dishonest to completely romanticize this reality. Life aboard a Viking ship was harsh, often brutal. Diseases still occurred. Men still died from severe infections. Dehydration occurred when the weather turned against them, or extreme hunger occurred when storms destroyed part of the provisions during the crossing. But there was no perfect system. There was a system significantly better than that of most cultures, of the kind built on trial, error, and constant adaptation. Many expeditions simply disappeared in the middle of the ocean without leaving a trace, precisely because of miscalculations or the unpredictable power of nature. Viking ingenuity reduced risks, but never completely eliminated the real danger of crossing a hostile ocean in open vessels without any protection against the extreme weather. Despite extreme weather, it is precisely at this point that the story takes on a greater meaning, one that transcends the Vikings themselves. What you have just discovered is not just an isolated historical curiosity, but a powerful example of how human intelligence manifests itself long before modern technology. Without electricity, without industrial chemistry, without any precision instruments, an entire society developed methods of food preservation that we still use today, often without realizing their origin. Dried fish, salted meat, hard bread preserved by fermentation, and fermented drinks safer than stagnant water. All of this continues to be present in updated forms in pantries around the world, from Portuguese cardu and Brazilian shark to European sausages and Asian preserves. The real lesson behind this story is not about Vikings, ships, or battles. It's about how extreme necessity shapes human practical intelligence in ways that abundance never could. When there is no choice but to solve a problem with the resources available, humankind demonstrates an impressive ability to observe patterns and test solutions. It transmits knowledge from generation to generation, transforming survival into applied science, even without ever having written a single formula. But next time you open a refrigerator door without thinking twice, it's worth remembering that more than 1,000 years ago, men on a wooden ship in the middle of the North Atlantic solved the exact same challenge. They used only wind, salt, cold, and an impressive amount of knowledge. An impressive amount of knowledge accumulated through generations. If this story made you see the Vikings in a completely different light, leave a comment telling us which detail surprised you the most. Also, leave a like to help this video reach more people, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next documentary, narratives that reveal the most intelligent and least known side of human history. If you enjoyed understanding how survival shaped Viking ingenuity, you'll probably love it. Watch the video about how modern polar explorers learned valuable lessons from ancient indigenous techniques for surviving extreme cold.